cuties, I'm back. And today we're doing another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. Just waiting for the dog drama to be over. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. Today we are doing another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books. Today's book is a little different. It's actually a short story written by Shirley Jackson, and it is called The Lottery. Now, this book, The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson, is obviously a collection of short stories. And the last story in this book is called The Lottery. So since that's the title of the book, I thought that's the one we'll cover. This one is a bit of a doozy. It's a little on the disturbing side. Nothing graphic or anything like that. Just a little helicopter. Just a little, I don't know what to call that feeling when you see a movie or something that leaves you a little uneasy. That's a good word. It leaves you a little uneasy and a little bit freaked out. Or at least that's what it did to me. So if you want to hear this disturbing story and watch me do my makeup at the same time, stay tuned. Okay, so The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and this came out in 1948 as a little short story in The New Yorker. So it's 10 a.m. on a summer morning, and in this village, all the villagers are gathering together in the village square. Now, in some towns with very large populations, this whole lottery process can take up to 2 days and has to be started the day before the official lottery date. But in this village, there was only about 300 people that lived there, so the whole thing only takes like 2 hours. The boys in the village had started to gather stones, and some of the little boys had built a pile of stones in the corner of the square and were like guarding it from the other children. Now, the lottery was conducted by Mr. Summers, and when he arrived at the square, he was holding the little black box, and he had been a little bit late, and he was like, "Oh, sorry folks, running a little late today." Mr. Graves was following him into the square, and he carried a 3-legged stool behind him. Now, when all the villagers saw Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves with the little black box, kind of a little hush came over the crowd, and the crowd kind of parted and made room, kind of kept their distance, as Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves put the stool in the middle of the square, and they set the box on top of the stool, and Mr. Summers goes over to the box and he puts his hand inside and he starts kind of stirring up these little papers that are inside of the box. Now, the night before, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves had spent some time making up the slips of paper and putting them inside the box. And when they were done, they took the box to Mr. Summers' coal company and put it in the safe there for security purposes. And then they went and got it when Mr. Summers was ready to go to the square. Now, one of the villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson, had arrived a bit late. And when she got there, she was like, "Oh, sorry everyone, I forgot what day it was, but I just remembered." And then she's looking around in the crowd to find her family. She sees her husband and her kids up towards the front of the crowd. She makes her way up there, and when she gets there, Mr. Summers says, "Oh, thought we were gonna have to start without you, Tessie." And she says, "Wouldn't have me leaving my dishes in the sink now, would you, Mr. Summers?" And everyone laughed. I guess this was a joke. So then Mr. Summers says, "Well, I guess we better get this going and get this over with." He's like, "Is everybody here?" And then several people started shouting out, "Dunbar, Dunbar's not here." So Mr. Summers, he consults a piece of paper that he has with him. And he's like, "Dunbar, Dunbar. Oh yes, Dunbar. He broke his leg, right? Okay, who's drawing for Mr. Dunbar today?" And a woman speaks up and she goes, "Well, I guess I am." Mr. Summers says, "Oh, you don't have a grown boy to do it for you?" And everyone knew the answer to this was no, but the lottery official had to ask her like in a formal way to make it official, I guess. So he asks her, "Oh, you don't have a grown boy to do this for you?" And she says, "No, my son's only 16, so I guess I have to draw for the old man this year." So Mr. Summers makes a note on his piece of paper, and then he says, "Watson boy, are you drawing this year?" And kind of a tall, awkward, lanky boy says, "Yes, I'm here. I'll be drawing for my mother and me." And then people in the crowd start saying things like, "Good fellow, Jack. Glad your mother's got a man to do it." And then Mr. Summers says, "Well, okay, I guess that's everyone. We should get started." Then a hush fell over the crowd, and Mr. Summers said, "Well, I'll read out the names of the heads of family, and then you each come up one at a time, draw a piece of paper from the box, but don't look at it until everyone has had a turn to draw from the box." Now, the people had done this so many times before, they didn't really need to listen to these instructions. They knew, what was going on and the proper way to go about doing this. So Mr. Summers was calling all the names of the heads of household, and one at a time they would go up and they would take a piece of paper from the black box. As all the heads of households take their turn, we get little glimpses of conversations going on throughout the crowd. Mrs. Delacroix and Mrs. Graves were kind of standing back behind the crowd and whispering to each other. And one of them was like, "It seems like there's hardly any time in between lotteries anymore." And the other was like, "Yeah, I know. It feels like we just did one like a week ago." Mr. and Mrs. Adams were standing next to Old Man Warner. And Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, he says, "I've heard in the North Village they're thinking about doing away with the lottery." And Mr. Warner was like, "That's a stupid idea, listening to the young folks." He's like, "There's always been a lottery. What are these young folks gonna have us do? Go back to living in caves?" And he's like, "There used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. Young fools." So he obviously does not agree with this kind of new thing that's been going on with, getting rid of the lotteries. Then we hear Mrs. Dunbar talking to her son, and she says, "I wish they'd hurry up. They always take so long." And her son is like, "Chill out." He's like, they're almost done. And she's like, "Okay, well, you get ready to go run and tell Dad." Then Mr. Summers called his own name, and he stepped forward and he took a piece of paper from the box. So when Mr. Summers finished taking roll, he held up his piece of paper in the air. He said, "All right, go ahead." And for a moment, nobody moved. But then all of a sudden, all at once, you hear all the little pieces of paper unraveling and opening. And then you start hearing all the women saying, "Who's got it? Who got it? And then all the voices start saying, it's Bill. Bill Hutchinson got it. So Bill Hutchinson was just standing there staring down at this piece of paper, and his wife, Tessie, starts screaming and yelling at Mr. Summers and starts saying, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to pick the piece of paper that he wanted. I saw you. She's like, it wasn't fair. We should do it over. And Mrs. Delacroix is like, be a good sport, Tessie. And then Mrs. Graves is like, yeah, I mean, we all took the same chance. And Bill Hutchinson is like, shut up, Tessie. So Mr. Summers looks at Bill and he says, how many kids, Bill? And Bill's like, 3. He says, there's Bill Jr., Nancy, and little Davy. And then Mr. Graves takes 4 pieces of paper and he puts them into the box. Then he takes the paper from Bill and puts that one in the box as well. And then Mr. Summers says to Bill, he's like, are you ready? And Bill looks over at like his kids and his wife and he nods. Now Mr. Summers says to the family, he's like, okay, one at a time, go up and take a piece of paper, but remember, leave it unfolded until everyone has had a chance. And then he turns to Mr. Graves and he's like, you help little Davy, because he's like a toddler, I guess. And Mr. Graves helps little Davy up to the box, and little Davy reaches into the box and he's kind of laughing and he grabs a piece of paper. And Mr. Summer says to little Davy, he's like, okay, remember, take just one piece of paper. And so he gets, Davy gets the paper and Mr. Graves takes the paper out of his little tight fist and then just stands there with Mr. Graves looking up at him wonderingly, like, what are we doing here? He's only a toddler, right? So he's like, I don't know what we're doing, but I'm helping. Then all the Hutchinsons opened their little piece of paper. Mr. Graves opened little Davy's, and everyone in the crowd sighed relief when Mr. Graves held up little Davy's piece of paper to the crowd to show them that it was blank. Then Bill Jr. and Nancy opened theirs at the same time, and again they kind of laughed and looked at each other and then turned to the crowd and showed everyone that theirs were blank as well. Then Mr. Summers looks at Tessie and he goes, okay, go ahead, open your piece of paper. But she kind of just stands there silent. So Mr. Summers looks at Bill Hutchinson, her husband, and Bill opens his and it's blank. And so Mr. Summers says, it's Tessie. And he's like, Bill, show us her paper. So Bill Hutchinson goes over to his wife and he forces the piece of paper out of her hand. He opens it up and he shows it to everyone, and there's a black spot on the piece of paper. The same black spot that Mr. Summers had put there the night before when he was getting all the papers ready. So Bill holds the piece of paper up to show the crowd, and Mr. Summers says, okay, let's get this over with. Now, this tradition of the lottery had been going on for as long as they could remember, but the original rituals and the original black box that had gone along with this since they could remember had been lost. But the one thing that they did remember to do in a traditional way was to use stones. And there were stones all over the ground, and little white scraps of paper were blowing everywhere in between the stones. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so big she needed both of her hands to pick it up, while Mrs. Dunbar had kind of gathered a bunch of little stones and was holding them in both her hands. The children had their stones all ready to go for a while now, And somebody gave little Davy Hutchinson some little pebbles, so, you know, he could participate as well. Tessie was kind of in a cleared space in the square now, and the villagers were moving in on her, and she was yelling, "It's not fair, it isn't right." And then a stone hit her in the side of the head. And Old Man Warner was saying, "Come on, everyone, come on, let's do this." And she just kept yelling, "It's not fair, it's not fair," as the whole crowd moved in on her. The end. Whew. It's a pretty disturbing one. I'm not exactly sure what the author's message is, but that's why I like stories, is because they're really, like any art, is up to the interpretation of the one viewing the art. So stories like this mean whatever they mean to you. Now, I had several thoughts about what this could mean. First of all, very disturbing, especially the fact that they even had babies participating in this. Little Davy was a toddler, and not only was he still expected to participate in the lottery by choosing a piece of paper, but he was also expected to participate in the stoning. And then, you know, another kind of thought that I had was, is this illustrating that most people are okay with injustice until it's happening to them or their group? Because the villagers were very casual and nonchalant. I mean, they were like a little bit nervous, but it felt very normal for them to be doing this. Nobody had any type of outrage before the stoning started. The only one that had any outrage was Tessie, because she was the one that was chosen. But even before, Tessie was just like making light of it. "Oh, sorry, I'm late, da 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 da." So then I was thinking, okay, well, why are they doing this lottery in the first place? And one of my thoughts was that, you know, Old Man Warner had mentioned that saying, "Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon." So does this mean that there's some sort of limit on resources, and this is kind of how they thin out the crowd somehow? But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of seems that way with him saying that. Like, yeah, the more people that they kill off with this stoning ritual, the more food is available for everyone else. And then another thought that I had, that this could be drawing a parallel to, but I'm not quite sure, because this was written in 1948. So I don't know if like cancel culture was a thing then. I'm sure it probably was, but they probably just didn't have a name for it. And I have a feeling it maybe wasn't as, I don't want to say as prevalent, but people maybe weren't as aware as we are these days with the internet and everything. Because yeah, it kind of like just seems like, oh, let's just pick a random person and do away with them. And while cancel culture doesn't literally kill somebody, it does kill their reputation, their careers, that kind of stuff. And sometimes I guess it could be justified, and other times not so much. So yeah, anyway, bizarre and disturbing story, but very thought-provoking. I would love to hear what you guys think of this story. What do you think it's drawing a parallel to? Help me out. Also, let me know if there are any books or stories that you would like me to cover on this channel. If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It's how I know what kind of videos to make, and it lets me know you care. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss more disturbing stories. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. So it's 10 a.m. on a sunny, first sentence, messed it up. Wouldn't having me leaving me. Good fellow, Jack. Glad she's... Good fellow, Jack. Glad your mother's got a man to do it for him. Do it. Good fellow, Jack. Glad your man... Oh my God. And... It's actually a short...